the Key Biscayne Community Foundation in Programs and Donor Relations. Today we would like to present one of our many lectures as part of the Life Enhancement Forum, which has been generously provided by Mr. Marius Robinson, a key resident, a cherished key resident of Key Biscayne. Now, for those of you that don't know, we have Karen Koffler, MD, here with us today. She is the medical director for the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Miami. Her practice philosophy is simple. Humans have an intrinsic capacity to heal. Her job is to work with the patient to optimize the body's healing powers using the functional medicine models. If you all don't know her already, please call her, find out more about her practice and what she can offer, but she will expand on today's topic is directly touching on some of the advancements in medical research.
Thank you. Okay, hi, thank you. And thanks for coming out on this gorgeous evening where you actually could be walking around your island and not be here right now. So I appreciate you doing that. And I hope you all are walking home. Some of the information that we learned in the 2019 annual conference, for those of you who don't know, we do a yearly conference at the University of Miami on nutrition and different advances. This next year will be all about the brain. And we're a very inclusive group. So if you watch the University of Miami Osher Integrative Medicine website, you'll see we'll begin to announce that conference. It's early in September. Hopefully there'll be no hurricanes. And we'll be bringing in researchers and clinicians from really all over the world who will be talking. It's a 2-day conference, so look for that. And we have other programs that we have that are ongoing, so you'll be able to find that on our website. This was from 2019, and I'm going to just hit some of the highlights, and I've distilled it down. Basically what happened at this conference is that we had a lot of researchers, and so they were presenting their data. For a regular person, that could be pretty boring. After a while, you want them to just sort of cut to the chase. So that's what I've done here, is really try to pull out some of the interesting facts that they taught us about. So the microbiome. Is anybody here familiar with that term, microbiome? Hands up high, great. Oh, good, so not everybody is aware of the microbiome, good. All right, so you are host and hostess to trillions of bacteria that live on and in you, so that when you get like a cut and you get an infection, it was just from a bug that was nearby, and maybe your immune system wasn't quite up to snuff at the moment, and so didn't put it out immediately. But most infections that we get are a result of things that are living in and on us. The coronavirus is an exception to that, of course, but otherwise, when we get sick, I would ask you to ask yourself, why did I get sick now? Because, like I said, if these bugs are in and on you all the time, why were you vulnerable? And that's a worthwhile question so that you could correct the thing that might have led to the illness. Your microbiome became the microbiome is all of the organisms, the viruses, the fungi, the parasites, the bacteria that live within your gut. And you first got them ideally when you came through the vaginal birth canal. So for those of you who were born vaginally, which is one of the first questions I ask my patients, were you born by C-section or vaginal? Vaginal delivery, babies are picking up the bacteria of their mothers. They're actually doing a little bit of swallowing, which is, an action that they've learned in utero. So the bacteria is going down and up into the colon. So you have trillions of bacteria living in your colon. And they have an incredibly important function there. They digest our food. They train our immune system. Realize 75% of your immune system is housed within the gut. And when a baby is first born, that immune system has not seen anything infectious. It knows nothing about foreign objects. The bacteria that move into the colon actually teach your immune system, your nascent immune system, what is self, what is not self, what's harmful, what's not harmful. So we are very dependent on these microorganisms that live within us that we get inoculated with. So they help us digest our food, they help with immune function, they produce our vitamins. Vitamin K, which I do give to patients, actually is also made by the bacteria in your gut. And vitamin K has a very important role in clotting, but it also has a very important role in keeping calcium out of blood vessels and in bone. It helps us metabolize toxins. It helps us break down mercury and other heavy metals and pesticides and so forth. And it protects us from pathogens. They will see bad guys coming down the pike and attack them before they can take root and affect our gut lining. And we want them to be remarkably diverse. The more diversity to our bacteria, the more of a gamish, a mix that they are, the healthier they are and the healthier we are. And when we look at studies over time, and Dr. Messier, who presented this talk, explained this to us, we are watching our patients develop less and less bacterial diversity, which means we are going to be less healthy, less resilient. What do you think is the #1 reason why we are experiencing less diversity? Antibiotics. Antibiotics. So I want you to think about this. When you have a cold and you feel miserable and you go to your doctor because you want an antibiotic, because you can't be inconvenienced by your coughing or your sneezing or your crappy feeling, the question you're going to ask them is it essential that I take an antibiotic for this? An antibiotic kills only bacteria. It will never kill a virus. So if they can't tell you this is absolutely, without a doubt, a bacterial infection, then it's okay to take an antibiotic. Realize if you're a Chinese peasant living out in rural China, you're not going to get antibiotics if you get exposed to bacterial infection. You'll get herbs and you'll get better. So antibiotics aren't the only way to cure things. I am not a purist. I don't say don't take antibiotics. I certainly do use them. But I want you to be careful that you're not taking them unnecessarily. So the more resilient the microbiome, the more resilient you will be as the host. So there are a lot of age-related changes in our gut microbiome that it can be associated with a rise in things like inflammation, irritable inflammatory bowel like Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, colon cancer, cardiovascular disease, things you wouldn't think are related to the bowel and the microbiome. Studies are now showing that they are. Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease. If there's inflammation or low-grade infection in the gut, there is going to be inflammation of the brain lining as well. Very often people who have inflamed guts feel a quality of brain fog, and it can be related to that. Also, if you're eating foods that are causing inflammation, brain fatigue, poor concentration, poor memory are some of the side effects of that. And also, as we age and we're exposed to different things, up here shows the different kinds of bacteria that tend to dominate over time. So what we're born with and what we morph into as we age changes over time in terms of bacteria. And other things that can influence that are medications. So a really classic medication, besides antibiotics that can influence the health of our microbiome, are the proton pump inhibitors, Nexium, Zantac, Prilosec, Pepcid, that's many of which are available over the counter. Those medications suppress acid. Acid is produced by the stomach at great expense. It takes a lot of energy for your body to produce acid. It is produced in one place and one place alone, and that's the stomach. And then it's shot out into the stomach. And then the stomach has to create a protective lining to itself so it doesn't get burned by its own acid. This is all very labor intensive. So there's a reason why we go through all that in order to protect ourselves. Acid is the #1 way we kill off microorganisms that are harmful to us. So for those of you who've been placed on some of those medications, it is not meant to be long-term. In fact, they never did long-term studies, and I can't believe the number of patients that I see who've been on Nexium for 20 years. It should never be used like that. It's short-term, can be very effective, but you have to get at the root of why you even need that medication. Hospital stays, menopause can actually influence the bacteria that live within our gut. Our weights, how much our weight changes throughout the course of our lives will influence the health of the bacteria. Anything that we get affected by, including stress, by the way. When we are stressed, our good, healthy bacteria also become stressed, and they may die off. So over time, there can be a shifting in those organisms. And what does eating do to this microbiome? Well, they particularly do well with a high-fiber diet. So what food group has high fiber? Grains, vegetables, everything from the plant kingdom, right? So that's why we emphasize a plant-based diet. I do not believe in any one diet. As a vegetarian, I do not believe that everybody should be a vegetarian at all. In fact, vegetarian diets are not a perfect diet because you have to supplement with what to be on a vegetarian diet? You may need protein, but you might be able to get enough. B12. Anything that you have to supplement a pill for is not a native or natural diet, right? You would never be able to survive in the wild like that. Having said that, a plant-based diet is really an ideal diet. So what that looks like when you look at your plate is at least 3/4 of the plate is covered with plants. So that's an easy way to remember it. We like for you to get 9 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, and a fist is a serving. So you can imagine, you know, a nice salad will probably be about 4 fistfuls, if you like me. Okay, so we actually have an increase in certain bacteria when we're eating, and other bacteria become quiescent. And when we're not eating, those bacteria that were quiet will become more active and proliferate, while the other ones become more quiet. So there's this ebb and flow to the activity of the bacteria within our gut. Aren't you interesting? You're like walking around with many more bacteria than you have of your own human cells, and they've got this whole life cycle going, and they're very dependent on you. And by the way, they also drive certain behaviors. So some of those microorganisms particularly like sugar. And so when you have an outrageous sugar craving, you may think it's you, but it may also be an overgrowth of yeast that's driving that, because they need sugar as a substrate, as a fuel source. So fasting results in an increase in those bacteria, as I said, that were suppressed while we were eating. And this is Mother Nature's way of retaining this balance. It's very, very remarkable. We also are beginning to see, and I'll talk more about this, that periods of fasting are really essential. So who are the grazers in the room? Who likes to graze a little bit throughout the day? Yes. Stop it. After today, that behavior has to end. And the reason is not only are the bacteria being influenced by whether or not you're eating, but you have a cleansing mechanism in the gut. You have little tiny cilia, or little tiny hairs, that basically sweep out the debris, but only between meals and at night. So when you're grazing throughout the day, you dismantle that cleansing action of the gut. So be more of a meal eater and quit the noshing. High-fat diets create obesity in part because of the impact on the microbiome. Very high-fat, particularly saturated fat diets, have a predilection to allow certain organisms to grow that are really good at extracting calories, which cause you to gain more weight.
Does that mean that the idea of eating 6 small meals a day, which is like grazing, is really not the best thing for you.
Super passe. You're right. You like it. See how we teach you guys? This is the new rule. This is the way you have to live. And then we're like a few years later, okay, that wasn't right, and I'm so sorry, so stop doing that. But what I always like to do, and the way because I'm subject to the same thing you all are. Eggs are in, eggs are bad. Coffee's great, don't drink coffee. You could get crazy. If you think about what has allowed us to survive, look at indigenous cultures. That's what I often resort to. How do indigenous cultures survive? Do they eat constantly? They can't. They couldn't, right? They didn't have access to food constantly. They had periods of fasting and periods of feeding. Turns out we're brilliantly built for fasting, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. All right, what about our circadian rhythms? There is an influence of the sunlight on our bacteria as well. Light and dark cycles influence the bacteria in our gut as well. So sunshine allows us to build more of a mucus layer that encourages the growth of the good bacteria and discourages the growth of the bad bacteria and allows us to create this protective coating within our gut. And excessive darkness decreases bacterial diversity and increases leaky gut. And when I lived in Chicago, anybody live in the northern latitudes and sort of had to fight your way through the winter? I remember February was always the worst month to be in Chicago. You're from Alaska. Oh my gosh, I don't know how you said, well, now you go to the opposite, right? Oh, I see. Yeah, so I wonder if it isn't the increased gut permeability or leakiness, that inflammation that actually contributes to the seasonal affective disorder some people have. Not only the lowered vitamin D that would do that, it's probably multifactorial, but it's sort of interesting that our guts are affected by light and dark as well. 2 nights of sleep disruption also changes your bacterial composition. It decreases diversity, and it can take 2 weeks of a good night's sleep to recover from that. And what's a good night's sleep in adults? How many hours? 7 to 9. How about our teenagers? 9 to 12. And I find it so interesting that just as my last child is about to graduate high school, Miami-Dade Public Schools is taking a look at whether or not our high school kids, or should there be a change in the sleep schedule for those kids. Okay, what about stress? We talked a little bit about this. A balanced nervous system, and we can tell this through a very interesting test called heart rate variability. I want to tell you a little bit about it. It sounds very technical, but here's the story. Each beat of your heart, it may feel like it's exactly 60 beats per minute, let's just say, which would be great. And by the way, just as an aside, when you go to your doctor and you get your vital signs taken, it's not good enough for them to say, it looks good, or even not say anything. I want you to take out your phone and put your vital signs in there. I don't want to see a heart rate above 80 in any of my patients. And you certainly should not live at a heart rate higher than 80. And we don't pay enough attention to that. That's a heart that's working too hard. There's too much adrenaline and cortisol stimulating that organism. We should all be living at well less than 80. If you're an athlete, you're probably living in the 50s or 60s. That's where I want you. 60s, 70s, not higher. When you go for a walk or you're exercising, it's okay, it's normal, it's appropriate for the heart rate to pick up. But there's no one in this room who should be living at a heart rate higher than 80. We see increased morbidity and mortality in those that live at a higher heart rate. And that's because it's responding to stress. It's responding to chronic low-grade stress, and we have to figure that out. So heart rate variability looks at the variation, takes a deep look at the variation from one beat to the next. They're never perfectly equal, because just that movement of my hand, the heart adjusts. Every time you inhale, the heart adjusts. Every time you exhale, the heart adjusts. If you yawn, if you're digesting, if there's a loud noise, the heart is constantly sensing everything that's going on for the organism and making these adjustments. And when it's not doing that so well, that means your heart rate variability is beginning to drop. And that's not a good sign. It means you're not as responsive to your environment. So when they did these studies that showed that when the heart rate variability was balanced, the microbiome was healthier. The bacteria were thriving more. And when the heart rate variability starts not doing so well, the bacteria in our guts also don't do as well. So stress harms us and harms the bacteria. So I want you to think long and hard if getting frustrated by Miami traffic during the Super Bowl is worth it. You know, is it worth it for you to get upset by what's happening at the checkout counter at Publix or wherever you are? All the little things that we allow to affect us, you have to really think about, is it worth what it's costing you and your bacteria? Most of the time, the answer is no, I would guess. So how do we care for these critters? Get a good night's sleep, because it's bedtime for you and it's bedtime for them. Remember that you're not just feeding yourself. You're feeding these guys who are going to keep you well, who are going to keep you healthy. We really emphasize trying to fast 3 hours, starting your fast. Remember, it's called breakfast in the morning, because presumably you've been fasting and not like getting up and having a little nosh at 2 o'clock in the morning. So the fast, we feel, should probably begin at about 3 hours before bedtime. This is directly taken from Dale Bredesen's work. Does anybody know who Dale Bredesen is? You do. What has he done? Do you remember? The Bredesen method, exactly. So Dale Bredesen is one of the first, if not the first, neurologists who helped us to realize that you could reverse dementia. And he does it in a whole host of ways. And one of his rules is stop eating 3 hours before bedtime. For whom would that be hard? I mean, that would be hard for me, actually. Like tonight, for instance. That means no dinner. Okay, so 3 hours, because what happens is when you give yourself that much time, you actually have a higher production of growth hormone and a higher production of melatonin. Melatonin, you probably know, helps us sleep, but it's also a phenomenal antioxidant. It cleans up a lot of debris. And growth hormone helps preserve lean muscle mass, helps us repair damaged tissue, helps keep us vital. So you want that, and that's an easy way to get it. Well, a not so easy way, but a good way to get it. And then, you know, it's really interesting to me when they serve alcohol on a plane, because that is the most vulnerable time. That is one of the most vulnerable times that we routinely have, is when we're flying. We're in stagnant air, we're being irradiated, we can't get up and move around, the food is awful. I mean, the list goes, I have very few patients who are constipated as a result of flying, even just to like New York. So alcohol messes with the gut, it's a stressor on the system. So that's probably not the time to enjoy alcohol if you can get by without it. Okay, any questions on the microbiome? Sure. Mm-hmm.
What about people who have AFib and their heart rate is
Who live in AFib or have intermittent AFib?
live 100% of the time in AFib?
So it's a really good question. You know, if they don't have a pacemaker, there is still beat-to-beat variation, even if it isn't. Even if it's an erratic beat, because there's still, if you look at somebody with AFib, they still have a slight difference from beat to beat. And I don't know the answer as to whether or not AFib causes them to have a worsened heart rate variability. I don't even know if it's been looked at. Yeah, but I would not, I am quite sure that there is a beat to beat variation in people who have AFib, for sure.
And you were talking about vitamin K, but people who are
On blood thinner.
on blood thinner should
Right.
be taking vitamin
Okay,
K.
so you can't necessarily take vitamin K, but you should be eating green leafies and let them, you're probably no longer on Coumadin because we're not using that anymore. You should continue to eat green leafies, though. The newer medications that they use work in a different way. Yeah, yeah. Uh-huh.
Is Is there an effect of psychological and emotional states on the biome?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we know it best by looking at like depression and sort of lower mood states and anxiety. That will injure the microbiome. So a happier, more joyful disposition leads to a more robust and diverse microbiome. And the opposite is true as well. It's interesting how biology helps to create our experience. Mm-hmm.
Yes, do you believe in taking probiotics?
Great question. I thought somebody might ask that. I most strongly believe in probiotic foods. So what are probiotic foods? What are foods rich in probiotics? Sauerkraut, yogurt, kefir, pickles. Excellent. That's exactly right.
Even though they're all
Kombucha. Yes, even if they're salty. I don't ascribe as much to the no salt across the board. Very few, as it turns out, very few people. We've been very aggressive about taking people off of salt. African Americans typically do have more of a salt-responsive blood pressure issue. Caucasians less so, but we blanketly have taken everybody off. But when it comes to fermented foods, I would make an exception. So pickles, kombucha, sauerkraut, yogurt, kefir, and that includes coconut yogurt and coconut kefir, kimchi. Those are the big ones. Yeah, so if you can incorporate that, and a little sauerkraut on your salads, for instance, it adds a great flavor. So I would encourage you to do that. So number one is by food. Number two, I do use probiotics in certain conditions. If somebody's got GI issues, I will put them on probiotics, but I rotate them every month. Because I don't want you going out and buying like Garden of Life 50 billion probiotics and taking them for like 5 years. Because that doesn't augment diversity, right? I want you to switch around the companies. So when you finish that bottle, get another bottle. Yeah. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask, and I'm not quite sure how to ask it, what are your thoughts on FMT?
Are you talking about fecal transplants?
Yeah.
Yeah. That was actually presented, and it's not ready for prime time, though there are people who are doing it sort of on their own, and I'm a little nervous about that. So she's talking about fecal transplants, which actually have saved the lives of patients who were dying of typically C. diff, Clostridium difficile colitis. And now it's being looked at to be used in a lot of different other conditions where they take the microbiome. Well, they basically take the stool and they distill out through a remarkable process the good bacteria of a healthy person, often someone living. It can be somebody living with the patient, but it's a complicated thing as to how you can figure out what's a healthy microbiome because nobody really knows. Everyone's microbiome is different because we've all had different exposures, we're all from different places and so forth. And they give it to the patient who has a diseased bowel, and it can create, it can reinstate health. It can totally stop C. diff colitis, which is the first studies that were done. We're going to see more about that. Like I said, one of the researchers in that field, one of the leading researchers in that field actually presented to us. But it's not, I can't prescribe it myself for patients right now, so. But it will be something that we do see. All right, let's talk a little bit about the fasting mimicking diet. Has everybody seen, or has anybody seen this book? I actually brought a copy. This was presented by Sebastian Brandhorst. Has anybody seen this, The Longevity Diet? Yeah? This is worth picking up. In fact, feel free to have a look. We can pass that around. So Sebastian's the right-hand man of the author of this book, Walter Longo, who's sort of out there on the speaking circuit. They were approached by the National Institutes of Health, or National Institutes of Aging, I think, to come up with a way of making fasting possible for more people. So Sebastian began his talk by pointing out that that there's a number of diseases. These are the 9 most common diseases that we see in people over 65. And what he said, which was really striking to me, is that 80% of us 65 years or older have at least one of those diagnoses, and 70% of us have 2 or more. And the point is, as we age, our systems are beginning to sort of sequentially fail. And so aging puts us at risk of developing diseases. But we know that if in our 60s, if we maintain a high level of activity and we eat well, we can really minimize that. We can flatten that curve. And it's got to be maintained throughout age. So no one can't move. Said better, and not in a double negative way. Everybody has to move. Everybody has to exercise every day. There's no exception to that. Studies support that each of these domains play a key role, and what's really interesting is it's not just nutrition and exercise. Of course, it's social connection. I think we've hammered that home in many folks. Self-expression, the ability to find purpose and meaning, intellectual stimulation, and a spiritual practice that allows you to stay above the fray and keep your eye on the larger meaning of things. So at any point, when studies have been done at almost any point throughout the lifespan, there has been a positive effect. So it's good news to see that we can reverse whatever decisions that we've made that weren't perhaps as life-enhancing. So what this diet is a lot about is about how you manipulate food to enhance healthy aging and minimize disease. And calorie restriction has been looked at for really a century. And in every single animal that is calorie restricted, whether it's a fruit fly or a worm or a mouse or a cat or a human, there is greater longevity. And in fact, we should be eating 5% less per decade starting at 35. So think about it as you get older. How many of you all have consciously lowered your food intake as a result of just aging alone? If you have done that, that's really remarkable. There's a few ways that this actually can be done, this restriction of intake. It can be restricting to a specific period of time. And this is one that I've done. So I typically don't eat breakfast anymore. Remember how we used to say, breakfast is the most important meal of the day? That might have been true at some point, but we're finding that it's not true anymore. So many authors think that if you're going to eat less due to a time period, it's better to eat a lighter, earlier dinner and have breakfast the next day. I just never found I was hungry enough in the morning to have breakfast. So for those of you who have kids that can never eat in the morning, they're just not hungry, don't force feed them. It's okay. They will survive. It'll be okay. Let them take their calories in a little bit later. But as we get older, it's probably a better idea to front load your calories or take them in earlier in the day. One of the things that Sebastian was pointing out was when they analyzed the diets of average Americans, most of us get our daily caloric needs by lunchtime. So dinner is like an added bonus, and then we're surprised when some of us continue to gain weight over the years. So another way you could do it, so it's restricting the amount of time that you're eating. So eating only from let's say 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. That would be an 8-hour period of time. That during that period of time you take in calories, outside of that time you don't. Another way to do it would be intermittent fasting. So diets of alternating very low or no intake with days that you take in normal feedings. And then periodic fasting, where you do something like 5 days of regular eating and 2 days of a fast. They came up with this fasting mimicking diet, which they actually sell now in the form of something called Prolon. Has anybody heard of the Prolon program? Okay. All right, so I actually did it. And it wasn't easy for me, but I have patients who do it once every month because they really like how they feel on it. So what Walter figured out was what are the exact foods, the exact composition of foods that you need that will turn on genes that promote longevity, inhibit cancer, reduce insulin secretion, and yet can give you some feeling like you're eating. It comes in a little box. Every day you have a specific few things that you can eat, like 5 olives, a nut/fruit bar that they created, a powder that you make, that you reconstitute into a soup. It isn't like the most palatable thing in the world. These little kale crackers. I did not have an easy time, but I will say by day 3, my brain felt very, very sharp. And that's what a lot of people note. Has anybody done fasting before? What did you notice with it?
I really like it. I'm doing the 8-hour feeding.
Uh-huh.
That's pretty much what I do. I don't.
That's how you live.
But yeah,
Mhm.
and I find just overall I'm less hungry.
Yes.
It's just, I eat certain times and then I don't.
And you don't, and
think
you,
about food
right,
otherwise.
right,
Yeah.
because you've got that routine down. You've done fasting.
Yes. I fasted once for a week, another time for 10 days, and it helped heal some problems I had with colitis, perhaps. But I think that was induced by too many aspirin when I flew with people who had too many cigarettes, and I took aspirin because the headaches were from that. But nobody told me not to take too many aspirin.
Right.
But the fasting straightened me out.
Help heal your gut.
Doctors, they would say I would never eat raw food again, and now 90% of what I eat is raw food.
Isn't that interesting?
And I fast, at least one day a month.
You do. How do you feel when you fast one day a month?
It's fine. You just have to turn the switches somehow, or you might put just a couple tablespoons of apple juice in a glass of water a couple times, which satisfies you. But in general, it's just a matter of finding the right time when you aren't too busy or have pressure from other things.
Right.
Anybody else have experience?
Uh-huh.
I don't know if this would count as fast. It's my version. So in the past year, I went from my old-time habit of never being hungry in the morning, not eating till 11, sometimes 2.
Right.
But I was always hungry at night, and I would eat bedtime snacks. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and eat, sometimes more than once. And in the past year, I moved to restricting eating to 12 hours a day and aiming for 10. So probably 2-3 times a week I make it to 10. And in 7 months, both lost about 12 pounds while feeling I was eating a lot and whatever I want really, although I'm gluten-free, dairy-free, don't eat processed sugar, etc. Eating a ton.
You eat actually a great diet.
And
Just food.
But
You're
I
eating
found
food.
that I am hungry in the morning if I don't eat at night.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
it switched that, but I feel great. I feel energized, and I feel like I eat a ton of food, and I've never kept track of calories. I count I'm eating fewer calories.
Right.
But there's something about not eating after, say, 7 o'clock until the next day, like
Right,
8 9 in the morning. That
And that's what we find. I mean, I think a lot, we've focused a lot on the content in people who have been trying to lose weight, for instance, it's, measuring out, and there's been all kinds of ways in which people have focused on, high fat, low carb, high carb, low fat, all of that. And I have to say, one of the most immediate things that I've seen in people is when they change the timing of their eating. That has had a pretty big and immediate impact on most patients. So it's something to think about.
Can I ask you,
Yes.
with periodic fasting, when you say 5/2, does it mean eat 5 days and then?
And
don't
2
eat
days
for
of
2
more
days?
of like a water fast, yes, yeah. That to me is harder, but there's a lot of people who do that. Mm-hmm.
The intermittent fasting intake and lower no intake
Right.
reminds me of that anti-jet lag diet that I at least used to try, except there's no control because I never knew how didn't try it. But I think it was developed by Argonne Laboratories like decades ago.
I don't know anything about it. Tell us.
Oh, well, the idea was that it would help you reset your body clock.
Right.
So if you live on the West Coast and you're flying to Europe and you've got business meetings,
Right.
you want to be like awake and sharp.
Right.
And supposedly this, I think it started maybe 4 or 5 days before you were flying, you were supposed to start alternating days when you would eat like a normal, whatever was normal for you, and then a day where you would eat very little. And I think the day you flew, you would eat very little. And there were variations depending on whether you were flying east or west.
Wow.
But it,
And
I
you
don't know what
followed
the
it and it
connection is.
worked. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it worked. Like I said, there was no control because you never knew how you would have been if you didn't try.
Well, when you showed up at your meetings, were you sharp?
Of course. Always.
Okay. All right, so moving on. So what you eat, how much you eat, and when you eat all affects your metabolism, which includes your energy balance, your ability to create protein and heal damaged tissues, your ability to generate energy through mitochondrial function. And we're built to fast, because think about, like I said, in ancient times, there would be periods of eating and periods of not eating. So all major religions have fasts as part of their tradition, which is sort of interesting. And yet what we're watching is our life expectancy is starting to decrease, and that's in part due to obesity and the diseases that come along with it. So, as I had said before, most people in America meet their nutritional caloric needs by the time lunchtime hits. And unfortunately, we've been sort of trained to think of dinner time as our largest meal. And by doing that, we're creating more inflammation. And by the way, when you eat beyond satiety, so hopefully everybody in this room knows what it feels like to be full, that moment where you're like, I really don't need any more. So when we overeat past that communication, which involves about 28 that we know of right now, neurotransmitters, hormones, and other chemicals. So your body is having this big conversation between your gut, your fat, and your brain to regulate how much you take in. When you push past it because something tastes so good that it's hard to resist, the more you do that, the more you are provoking inflammation. And you all probably know that inflammation is at the root of every disease we see in adults. So I want you to be very thoughtful. Eat slowly enough, which is another big issue in the American lifestyle. Eat slowly enough so that you can feel that moment when you've had enough. And then you put your fork down, you put your napkin over it, you push your plate away, you pour water over it, you call the waiter, you do whatever you have to do, but then you're done. Tomorrow is a new day, the next meal is a new opportunity, right? That overeating, because something tastes so good, or because we're in the habit, or because we don't even realize it because we're multitasking, that we've had enough, is actually very injurious to the cells. It's almost as if, if you own a factory and you are on a very tight schedule where truck A comes in to deliver the fobs and truck B comes in after that to deliver the thing that connects to it, and then everything is done in sequence, and then it all moves through the factory correctly. It's like all the trucks showing up at once, and now the floor manager is freaking out and nobody knows what. It reminds me of that Lucille Ball, you know exactly what I'm talking about, where the chocolates are coming out so fast, and that's how it looks at the level of your cell. It actually looks like that. It stuns them, and they can't operate as well when they're being bombarded with too much information. Okay. So the other piece is realize that when you fast, at the level of the cell, within the DNA, you are turning on genes that are provoking more resilience, that are increasing your ability to produce energy and so forth. That's how we know fasting is a fundamental part of the human experience, and we should all do some form of it. And my suggestion would be try doing it with the timing. So stop eating, ideally 3 hours before bedtime, and don't eat for about at least 12, ideally 14, maybe 16 hours. That's what the research is looking at.
How do you feel about the glass of wine at night?
How do I feel about a glass of wine at night? So, I think it's a beautiful ritual. I think having a drink at the end of a day or at night or with a meal is a beautiful ritual. Having said that, and if you're healthy and feeling great, that's fine. But what I've often seen in my patients is they wake up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and they're not sure why. It could be the wine. They're not as sharp the next day, or they don't feel like they've had restorative sleep, and it could be the wine. It's got sugar. It's a complex wine in particular. I find that wine is metabolized differently from clear alcohols like vodka, gin, or tequila. So when I'm talking to patients who don't feel great, and that's usually the people who show up in my clinic, I will take them off of the alcohol and just see what they notice. And if that's hard, I'll switch them to a clear alcohol. Has anybody ever noticed that they do just fine with something like tequila, but they don't feel so good if they've had wine? You've noticed that. Yeah, you've noticed that. There's a way in which those clearer alcohols are metabolized. I had the good fortune of going through the first class of fellows in 1997, having no idea what was going to end up happening with this whole movement of integrative medicine. And I'm happy to say that they have since graduated about 1,800 doctors from that program. And when I presented to them, I was presenting on brain health. The French had an article come out not long ago that said if you're taking care of patients who are concerned about brain function, they have to stop all alcohol. They feel that American standards or American leniency about alcohol, and this is the French. So that's why I noted the article as well. I was like, if the French say that, I'm going to listen. They take everyone off of alcohol that they're dealing with cognition issues.
Then where does resveratrol fit into all that? They say it's good.
Yeah, so that's probably why, that's why it's a complicated issue. It is relaxing. It is a way for people to connect. All of those things are very good things. Resveratrol, you will have to drink about 100 bottles of wine in order to get what's in a capsule of resveratrol. And it's it's a component of probably other molecules that we haven't yet figured out. Resveratrol has a very protective effect, particularly on the mitochondria, which allow us to produce energy. So it's also protective against cancers and so forth. So it's a great compound. Again, if you're healthy and you feel good and your energy is where you want it to be and you have a good night's sleep and wine is part of your ritual, have at it. It's like, you may be lucky enough and have the George Burns genes. Do you know George Burns, he smoked, he drank, he stayed up late, he lived to like 102. So we should all be blessed with those great genes, and you may be one of them. But if you're not feeling good, that would be an aspect I would take a look at. Okay, so these are some of the things that we see with fasting. This is their fasting mimicking diet that they highlight in this book that they packaged into this prolon. But understand that the principles are the same no matter how you do it. You improve immune response, you reduce abdominal fat, you drop your cholesterol, lower blood pressure, lower blood sugar, and we already heard from someone who had inflammatory bowel that it helped heal their gut, which points to a fundamental principle that I operate under that I think is the notion behind integrative and functional medicine, and that is the human blueprint is that we're designed to heal. Right? Built into every cell is the capacity to heal. There are so many mistakes and errors and injuries that you're experiencing right now sitting with me that your body is busy repairing. And I love your story because it points to you just stopped the traffic in the gut and your gut healed itself. That's a remarkable story when you think about it. Okay. Okay, so one other thing that we find with fasting is it decreases amyloid, which is that material that tends to be generated in dementia patients, particularly the Alzheimer's type. And now, we use a ketogenic diet typically in our patients, but it involves that fasting that I told you about, 3 hours of not eating before bed, and then we limit the time that people eat their meals. So I'll just touch on a couple of other pearls from our presentation so that you get a full flavor of what we got exposed to. So genes affect us sort of minimally. Genes probably contribute maybe 10 to 20% of your overall health. The rest is how we live, eat, drink, breathe, think, move, and relate, all of which we're in control of. So I wanted to put that control back into your hands. Having said that, I firmly believe that the future of medicine is in genomics, and we are beginning to use that in our clinic as well. So with genomics, anybody get 23andMe done? Yes. So I just have to warn you that more sophisticated systems have found there to be errors in those direct-to-consumer things. Okay, so some people have been told they have a gene that they don't have, and also the way some of that information has been delivered is not good. Like, you don't want to learn. Like, I learned I have an AFib gene, actually 2 of them, which I figured I probably did since my dad had AFib. But if you're not working with somebody who can help you understand what that actually means, that can be a little troublesome. But what we do know is, for instance, the whole question of vaccines. And I want to make it clear, I am not an anti-vaxxer by any means. There is no doubt that vaccines have saved lives. I think that sometimes we get the flu shot we figured it out well, and it didn't transform by the time it got to the United States, and sometimes it morphs before it gets here, and it's only 30% effective. We did not grow up during the time of smallpox. Probably if we did, we wouldn't be here right now. But that vaccine saved lives, there's no question. But there are some people who I suspect, there are some kids who did not react, who have not reacted well to perhaps the excipients in the vaccine. And if we can test them and understand what genes they might have that make it more difficult for them or might make them more reactive to something like that. Or an example, somebody will be on a cholesterol-lowering drug like a statin, and they'll feel fine. And someone else takes it, and they get severe leg cramps or muscle aches. Why is that? Those are genomic differences that we now have the ability to say if you're going to have that reaction to a statin or not, or lots of other medications. We can analyze your genome and figure out, if you suffer from depression, what medications are more likely going to help you and what are going to create side effects. So to me, this is the future of healthcare. When we look at people's genomes, and the company that I'm working with is right now has about 600 different genetic differences that they've identified. The reason why I went with them is they did the research. They have a team of researchers that pull out of the literature all of the nutrients, the herbs, the supplements, the vitamins, the minerals that have a positive impact on that gene. So now I no longer have to guess, let's try this herb and see if it will work. It's helped other patients. Now I'll know, for your genes, this is actually the right one to use. So I think that's going to be the future of what we're able to do. We'll probably, at the time a child is born, sequence it immediately and know exactly what we need to protect them from.
Can genetic testing predict allergies?
More autoimmune phenomena. Allergies, not as much. More autoimmune. Yeah, good question. Okay. One other pearl, just to reiterate, minimize your exposure to antibiotics. And remember the question, can I get over this without taking an antibiotic? By the way, there are some great herbal antibiotics, and I'll give you one of my own secret little pearls. There's a company called Biobotanicals, put this in your phone. Biocidin, which is a combination of herbs. For all the kids going off to college in our neighborhood that my kids grew up with, I wanted to give them a gift, but I wanted to give them something meaningful. They didn't love this gift, but their parents did. I put together a little like first aid kit for when they would get the requisite 1,400 coughs and colds and flus when they went off to their freshman year of college. And in that kit was biocidin, which you can take as a tincture. You add it to water. It's got a bunch of herbs in it. It's rather powerful. You can't stay on it indefinitely, but it's a great antimicrobial. Prebiotics, like we talked about probiotics, these are prebiotics that feed your good bacteria. Everyone should be on at least 75%. 75% of what's here should be in your diet now. I'm hoping so. Easy to incorporate, particularly the cacao, which we use to make chocolate. Cacao. For those of you who've never experienced little cacao nibs, who uses smoothies? Who drinks smoothies? So you can get the Navitas cacao nibs that are really, adds a really nice little crunch to your smoothie. Probiotics do not have to be alive. For the person who asked about the probiotics, you don't have to refrigerate them. They don't have to be live cultures. What the data is showing is it's the outer coating of the bacteria that has an impact on your immune cells and the other bacteria that are in the gut. One of the other talks that we heard was from Scott Shannon. And Scott is a psychiatrist in Colorado who's worked for many, many years with a group, the multidisciplinary group for the study of psychedelics. Some of you are old enough to remember the work that was being done out of Harvard that got shut down at a certain moment. Psychedelics have been sort of completely forgotten about, except for a couple of tiny places where there's been a little bit of research done. For the most part, they put ketamine, which is a pharmaceutical. I don't usually think of it like that. But what they're finding is, particularly in the setting of PTSD, and Johns Hopkins just got a massive grant to study this in our vets, psychedelics in the form of psilocybin or LSD, which is a longer acting version of psilocybin, which comes out of mushrooms, has been found to be remarkably effective in completely stopping PTSD in our most profoundly ill vets. So this has gotten fast-tracked by the National Institutes of Health, and you're going to see a lot more research in this field. So for our patients that suffer from intractable depression, that have been through everything, including electroconvulsive shock therapy and so forth, this may be an alternative that is very effective and incredibly safe. I can't say that about ketamine. I put that on there because it was part of his presentation. But what we find is there's like no downside except if somebody has a not so great trip on it. But even then, they are gaining tremendous insight. What they see when they analyze the brains of patients who are using these substances to treat profound depression or PTSD is the entire brain lights up, and there's communications between segments that have not been communicating at all. And out of that, the patients seem to be able to have new insight and can see their lives totally differently. So a single trip for some of these folks, which is what they call it, can completely alter their lives. And I mean, we don't know anything else that works like that. So this is now under a lot of intense research.
Just a quick question, doctor. Is the psilocybin taken with, accompanied by a psychotherapist?
Excellent question. Excellent question.
Some type of guidance?
Under those conditions, very definitely. They're all psychotherapy assisted, so the person is not sort of just given this medication and like, have a great time, enjoy nature. They're in a very controlled, they talk a lot about set and setting, meaning what is the mindset, so they prepare the patient over a period of time, and then what is the setting? They create a lot of safety, and they are being sort of escorted through with somebody who has a lot of experience with it. Great question. MDMA, I don't remember what it stands for, but it's otherwise known in the club scene as ecstasy. Right, which has gotten very adulterated. but there's always been something. Interestingly, Andrew Weil wrote a book, Marriage of the Sun and, I think it was, Marriage of the Sun and Moon, where he looked at how cultures all over the world have had substances that altered consciousness. That was one of the things that he studied, that it's sort of like, again, intrinsic in the human design is to seek these higher states of consciousness. And our kids will do it pretty readily. And some of these medications, it's very interesting. What I always want to know is, what is this psilocybin, which is derived from mushrooms, what is it doing for the plant? Like, what role does it actually play in the plant? In humans, it has a certain effect. It's like cannabis. In humans, it has a certain effect. What is it doing for the plant? I haven't had a botanist answer that for me yet. There's another question.
Yes. So the psilocybin is used just a couple times? Or
Well, I'm not an expert in this. We wanted him to come in because we wanted to hear what's the latest in this. They have a very tight protocol. I don't think they've used it in patients more than 3 times. I don't think that they've needed to use it more than 3 times, but I don't know what the full protocol is. But it's very, when you go through studies, these studies are scrutinized by teams of researchers to assess whether or not it's a valid approach. So I bring it up just so that you're aware as the information comes out that there's some legitimacy to that. I think I'm going to end there because the rest of it is more of a social commentary on the future of medicine.
Doctor, what do you think about cannabis?
What do I think about cannabis? Yeah, right? All of a sudden, every drugstore, Bed Bath & Beyond sells it. It's like, oh my gosh. So cannabis has a very, very interesting history. The fact that it's not readily available is just, it shows you how economics drives everything. And it's worth understanding if you ever, are bored. There's a psychiatrist out in New York, I'm forgetting her name, but she wrote the book, The Pot Book. Actually, Andrew Weil contributed 1 chapter to it, but it's a compendium written by many researchers and scientists and others that talks a lot about the plant cannabis. I use that name specifically because that's its proper name. Marijuana was something created to sort of shame it, so that the alcohol industry could dominate, and anybody who used marijuana was probably like a wetback or some other sort of low life in society, and that was one way they ushered it out of society. But doctors used to prescribe cannabis all the time, just like, by the way, we used to prescribe cocaine. I wasn't around during those years. I also wasn't around when they were prescribing cannabis. But it shows you how things change, like those, I have seen posters where doctors are smoking in the consultation room. Some of you might have at some moment been exposed to that. So cannabis is an incredibly complex plant. And there are basically 2 main components that people are talking about. It's actually got a lot more to it that influence human health. But the CBD component, which lands on specific receptors in the human body, particularly the immune receptors, quiet inflammation. So it can be a very powerful anti-inflammatory. It also does a very good job for many of my patients for sleep. There are other components in it that seem to have an anti-cancer effect. The problem is, because it is not legal, there is not the research being done in the United States. We are typically the leaders in virtually everything in terms of research. This is one area where we're lagging behind the Canadians. But the country that's done the most work in this are the Israelis. They really have been looking at it for a long time. In fact, everything that we know right now about the plant has been done by really one main guy out of the Technion, I think, in Israel. At any rate, I think there's great promise with it. The problem is most of what you see is crap, has no CBD in it. So that's the challenge. If you just go in and try to purchase something, it's very hard. And in fact, my brother, who's a physical medicine and rehab doc and sees a lot of pain patients, there was a conference or a convention at the Miami Beach Convention Center in the fall. Did anybody happen to catch that? It was a scene. I mean, there were like go-go dancers and flashing lights, and I mean, it was insanity. And I realized that he and I were probably the only doctors there, and everybody else was a hustler trying to figure out how to get this to market. So that's the problem. I think there's a lot of low quality or no components products out there. I do have patients buy specific companies if I'm deciding to put them on CBD, and a little bit, you start very low. Low can be more powerful than high dose, so people have to really figure out. It works in a very individual way with different people, so you have to be careful, but not be careful because you're going to get high, because nothing in this state has a THC. One thing for sure that they don't have is THC, and it's the THC component that seems to have more of the psychoactive effect. Having said that, CBD can have a very nice anti-anxiety effect, which is classified as a psychoactive effect, but it's not going to make you high. It doesn't affect the brain in that way. There aren't those receptors in the brain that CBD affects. So,
I have a question. I have to ask you, because you made a comment about high-fat diets, and that is, I didn't get it all, but you extract more fat is extracted. Then you made a comment about the keto
diet. So it's the quality of the fat.
Okay.
So saturated fats are very different from fats derived from avocados, olives, and so forth. Those we encourage. Saturated fats we don't.
So the fat comment about the extraction, that was about
saturated fat, yeah, animal-based fat, which is saturated fat.
So
yes.
In the clinic, you all are following probably kind of like a vegetarian-based keto?
So again, I actually don't, because I have plenty of patients who are vegetarians for 20 years, and when they introduced meat to their diet, suddenly felt so much better. And I've had patients who, were meat eaters that became vegetarian and felt so much better. I think everybody has to find their diet. I want people to pay such good attention to how they feel that they know what foods do and do not work for them. Some people feel great on grains, and other people get inflamed on grains. Some people do just fine with dairy, and other people get inflamed with it. So, when many of my colleagues are like, no sugar, no dairy, no grains, no this, no that, no fun. But I feel like everybody needs to find their right diet and know what they feel energized by. And remember, food should energize you. If you want a nap after you ate, there's a problem with something you ate. Either you're having an inflammatory response to it, it whacked out your blood sugar, or something along those lines. But you have to really take a look at that. You should never feel like you want to go to sleep after you ate. Okay, does that make sense? Think about that. And then begin to analyze your diet. He's volunteering. Yes.
Yeah, I want to go back to the intermittent fasting, because
yes.
I've read so much about it. And yet at the same time, having Hashimoto's, the thyroid disease, I've been told that your sugar is not regulated well. So I'm just wondering, is the intermittent fasting good for everyone? Or there's some people that have to practice do more grazing, which I've mostly done, over the years.
I think if your thyroid is well controlled, if you're on the right dose for you, and that means you need to know your free T3 levels, because we tend to give to all thyroid patients T4 or Synthroid or levothyroxine, which does not have T3. T3 may have more of an influence on what you're talking about right now. But if your thyroid is well controlled, you should not have to eat that frequently. I would say this. Most of my Hashimoto's patients do not have to graze in order for them to feel good. The grazing for me, like if you're that person who gets hangry hungry and angry when you don't eat. You have to look at your carb concentration. That means you've trained your body to do better, to use carbs as a fuel source. Carbs are short-lived. If you don't use them, they get put into storage. And if you've trained your cells to rely on carbs as your main substrate, when that level begins to drop, your cells are going to get irritable. But if you have metabolic flexibility, you can use fat as your energy source. That's why you don't get hungry. Because she can pull out and use fat as a fuel source, and she doesn't have that dip in her sugars because she's got more of a steady state. So I would worry more about the composition of your food and not as much about your.
I hardly eat any carbohydrates, so I don't think it's
So you may need actually a little more fat in your diet. That's where I mean, I don't know you at all, but I would say maybe you could use a little more fat in your
I'm
diet.
glad you're telling me this because I sort of gave up on the idea. And I know that, that all the evidence is that it's important.
But there's a lot of possibilities in terms of fasting. Remember, you're fasting when you're asleep. That's one of the great benefits of sleep, is you're not going to be eating during that time. So if you maybe can extend that a little bit, remember 12 hours is a fast.
What about having coffee with nothing in it in the morning?
That's a fast. That's considered to still be a fast.
No.
Yes.
No, I'm a no.
No, and no carbs. No carbs. Yeah. Yeah.
And tea.
And tea is fine. Yeah.
What about turmeric?
Turmeric. Do you cook with turmeric?
A little bit.
Yeah.
On my food.
Yeah, so that's one of the darlings, definitely of the brain health people, because turmeric has so many, turmeric, which contains curcumin, that yellow color, has so many health benefits. Great anti-inflammatory, really inhibits neuroinflammation, helps clear out amyloid plaques, protects against all kinds of cancers. So I'm not a huge, put somebody on 47 different kinds of supplements, but if I were to put together a little roster, it'd be like vitamin D3, omega-3s, curcumin, and then there'd be a few others probably. Yeah.
Vitamin D capsules instead of sun give you the same benefit?
Because you don't want the damage from the sun. Yes, definitely. And we know that because we check levels. So most of us probably need at least 4,000 IUs of vitamin D3 in a capsule. And I encourage people to take it with K, vitamin K, so that we ensure that the calcium stays in bone and doesn't calcify arteries. Mm-hmm.
What about, Dr., olive leaf?
Olive leaf extract. That can be very potent. It's a great antimicrobial. You cannot stay on it. So if you're treating a condition, olive leaf extract can be very, very good, but probably not more than 2 weeks on it. It can be hard on the gut. It's a great antimicrobial. I don't know. Okay, confession, I'm a horrible cook. I've caused 2 house fires. So I stay out of the kitchen. And so I don't pay as much attention to anything having to do with the kitchen. But tell me where you're going, what you're thinking. Yeah, yes, okay, so it's just a little bit harder to regulate, right? So when you take it through the gut, everyone's absorptive capacity is different, so it's slow on and much more longer lasting, as opposed to, say, smoking it or when we use CBD, we'll use it sublingually. It's got a more rapid onset. So I think the only thing to be aware of is that it's going to have a longer duration of effect anytime you use the gut, as opposed to lungs or directly into the bloodstream.
I've been trying to get more effects from the bees for the nitric oxide.
Nitric oxide, right.
And by doing it in my mouth and holding it in my mouth for a while. Do you think that tends to work?
I can't remember what compound it is that induces an increase in nitric oxide. So higher nitric oxide is a vasodilator. It has a lot of other health benefits as well, but it opens up blood vessels.
The beets apparently
are rich in a component, but I don't remember what component it is, and if it diffuses through that way. It may. I haven't looked at the literature on that. Yeah.
But do you think it's a good idea to do that to increase your circulation?
Absolutely. When we're trying to lower blood pressure, beets, kale, peppers, hot peppers are 3 things that we incorporate into diets.
I've got low blood pressure, but I'm trying to get my legs to have more circulation.
More circulation. Yeah, so one thing you might want to look at are those vibrating plates and lymphatic massage might help with that. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maybe go back to the CBD oil. You
Yes.
mentioned that there are just a couple of different companies.
Well, there's probably many. There are many companies that do a good job, and there's many, many more that don't. So yeah, first of all, you have to know it tastes awful. Just very few companies do they taste good. I don't know if you're aware of any, but Quicksilver Scientific is a company out of California, out of Colorado. They're the company that I rely on that does heavy metal testing, and because they had the technology, they had certain technology that allows them to create a superior product. We have access to Designs for Health and Zymogen, which are 2 doctor lines that we, that we will tell our patients about, and we give them access through our ability to access it. Charlotte's Web is available online.
Dr. Mercola has a hemp oil that's relatively,
Mercola has one. That's probably a good one.
but it seems to be quite expensive.
CBD is not inexpensive. They're like $75 to $100 a bottle typically. Yeah, but it can last you quite a long time. Yeah, depending on how you dose it. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Do you use Quicksilver for your heavy metal?
Yeah, that's the company I use for. Yes, their Detox Cube. Mm-hmm.
About turmeric.
Yes.
I have a friend who lives in Spain, and he sent me this information that turmeric could be toxic in some way.
I haven't seen that. Yeah, I haven't seen that. I think probably everything can be toxic in some way, but I think in the amounts that we're probably talking, I haven't seen any issues.
Isn't it bad if you're on antidepressants or something?
There may be an interaction perhaps with some. I just haven't seen any issues. The problem with curcumin, turmeric, is that it's hard to absorb. It's not that bioavailable. So it really matters how the product that you buy. So there's actually 40 different ways that turmeric has been compounded to get into the body. And the best ones are sort of nanoliposomes. Just if you can remember that, nanoliposomes. They make them very tiny and they surround them in fat. Curcumin should always be taken with fat. It should always be taken with a meal because that's going to increase its absorption. Mm-hmm.
Fresh turmeric glue is actually now more widely available in stores. Do you prefer to use that then in cooking?
Spices, saffron, sesame. Here's an example. Sesame, most women have an elevation of cholesterol around the time of menopause. Turns out sesame has something called sesamol, which reduces that elevation and clears out amyloid plaque. That's sesame. So toast some sesame seeds and sprinkle them on whatever you're eating. Saffron, rosemary. Most of the spices have health benefits. We use mint all the time for digestive disorders. Fennel, that's why you have those little licorice fennels when you're walking out of an Indian restaurant, really enhances digestion. So if you like spices, have at it, because spices all the time we find health benefits to a variety of spices. So I would say yes, cook with it. Just realize that to absorb it best, you have to have it with fat. Okay, I have to go home. Thank you guys so much for listening.